Welcome to the Simpleton podcast. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'm here with Laura Heeman from
Hey, Clark.
Maryland, Hyattsville, Maryland. I'm sitting here in my woodshop in Kansas City. This is the second episode of our podcast about the new Traditionalist Movement in the Catholic Church. Laura, I had an interesting realization a couple days ago by looking at one of our friends' podcasts, the Pop Culture Catechism podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last podcast, we talked about neo-scholasticism being kind of like the way of theology before Vatican II, and they were trying to create some more room. And it's kind of hard to understand, I think, for us, even what that means. And they're trying to create more room without trying to create like change dogma or teaching, but, just create more ways of, in a sense, studying God and going to God and more sources. So anyway, during this podcast, one of the guests was very well spoken. And whenever he would talk about like piety or pride or humility or any virtue, it was like he'd like, you know what that really means? And then he would give this excellent philosophical definition of it. Right? I think you've seen this in the past. I've seen it in the past too. And oftentimes there's a little twist in the definition. You're like, oh, I didn't expect that little part. That's insightful, right? But there's also something about it that's like not usually what you totally build your life on, in a sense. And there's something about it that's kind of funny because it's like if you ever went to Jesus and said, what is pride? He'd be like, let me tell you about a widow.
Right.
And I think I've heard this described as like the Semitic mind. This way of Jesus speaking where it's like he's talking to you about the camel not going through the eye of a needle and all the problems and things like this, right? Which is very different than like a philosophical way of speaking, but obviously valid.
With the philosophical way, you want to pinpoint the thing exactly.
Right. You're almost saying what you know for sure, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like what Christ is doing, and I think the Church Fathers do this, the Desert Fathers definitely do this. They're telling you these stories that have like some issue in them that you could not define absolutely philosophically, but is like kind of a mysterious, interesting issue that you could still get something out of.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I think that's, like you tell kids stories to form them,
Right.
And it's like you don't need to tell them the lesson. You just kind of make sure you tell them good stories and it works on their psyche,
Right. So I thought that was interesting because I realized then that I was kind of seeing what the neo-scholastic method is in a sense. And I thought this was just, it's a great method, but there's also other methods.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that happened before we get into the meat of this podcast is I stumbled on this strange podcast of 3 atheists. None of these guys believe in the supernatural at all. And they were discussing the Traditionalist Movement in the Catholic Church.
Okay, that's pretty wild, yeah.
It's wild even that they know about it, and they knew about Latin Mass Catholics, they knew about, and they were very sympathetic to it. And so their take was interesting. They don't believe in the supernatural, they're only materialists. They had great respect for the Latin Mass tradition, and they thought of it kind of as the highest form of Western religion. They thought it really does work psychologically. Like if you can somehow dupe, as they would think, is if you could somehow like dupe yourself into really actually believing, then it was like an extremely powerful experience. And the other thing they thought was that Protestantism was the most philosophical form of Christianity.
So that's kind of, I went to CUA. I studied philosophy at CUA. Everything about Catholicism is like metaphysics, right? At CUA.
Right.
But so that's a kind of shocking. Why do you think what did they mean by that? Well,
I even know that like after a while, I was kind of raised fundamentalist Christian in a way. And after a while I thought, man, there is no theology in fundamentalist Christianity. Now there is, but like if you compare it to like the philosophical theology of Catholicism, it's just not philosophy anymore. It's more like just read the scripture and take it at face value. It's more which doesn't really feel like theology, But anyway, It's funny. I think they view Catholicism the way we would view paganism. And I mean paganism in the best sense, like some pre-Christian paganism in Europe or something, right? So if we could imagine paganism, you'd go in and you'd see like some amazing ritual and they're sacrificing some like garland bull, and I think you could be kind of like, wow, I'm like kind of caught up in the liturgy at some level. But you wouldn't expect to be able to have a thoughtful theological conversation with like a pagan priest.
Yeah.
You could almost compliment it as like really good show, or like something that sweeps you up, but you wouldn't expect it to be philosophical,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I
guess it's interesting because I think, right, so the Catholic Church takes into account the physical world more than a lot of like Protestants do. Like we have a lot of physical things that are physically symbolic, and we, this smells and bells, they say.
And they were also saying exactly the same things I said before I was Catholic. They were saying things like confession is brilliant. It's just a really great traditional form of therapy or counseling, and so I had kind of like believed this for a while, that all these Catholic traditions must have some value, just because otherwise, how did they exist? Just the evolutionary process of stuff that has no value doesn't just continue forever, right? But they hadn't like gone to the next step to say, is there actually like a philosophical infrastructure within it?
Right.
That's more than just an apologetic,
and I think from inside, like everything in the Catholic Church has philosophical underpinnings.
Right.
There's like nothing that doesn't.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they simultaneously did two things with this weird podcast. They simultaneously showed almost like the value of the traditionalist movement and showed the need for a Vatican II.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they were highly complimentary of how the ritual of the Latin Mass was effective, although it wasn't. But then they also were showing that it wasn't fully effective because they weren't able to tap into what's going on behind it. You know what I mean? They were showing like the need for the church to like continually like put the reasons and be more clear and be more available in thought to people, or it just becomes more like a paganism.
So, they didn't understand that there was like an intellectual engagement.
Right. Which I think is part of the whole point of Vatican II, is to strip away some layers and let people get to the church fathers and get to the scripture and things like this. Right. So it just was, I thought that was interesting right before we recorded listening to that podcast. So this podcast is about the psychological and sociological concerns with the traditionalist movement. I've heard a lot of my friends express concerns. They never like necessarily put their finger on what the concern is, but they're just like, I'm stealing this line from you, Laura. The mass I love, the culture I hate. Is that what the line is?
The mass you love with the people you hate is something a friend of mine said.
That's rough. All right.
Yeah. And I kind of don't want to totally say that, because I think like I have friends here that I think would consider themselves traditionalists that I like being around, Yeah.
I think that statement is like a Trump statement. It's like, maybe there's a hair of truth in it, but it's like an overstatement. Right. But,
but what we were thinking, about this podcast and sort of this set of podcasts, I was like, why do we want to do this? Cause I don't want to like just sit here and attack a group of people or something. But to me, I think the point is that there is something that is like pervading the more traditionalist movements, and like right now, maybe people would point to Latin Mass type Catholics. But I think, when I was in college, I didn't know Latin Mass Catholics, but I knew like very conservative Catholics. And there was something that people were troubled by, and right. So, and it's not just like, we're not picking on one thing, but there's a negative thing that is kind of like pervading the movement, a sort of negative.
I would like to say my motivation was, I think there's a real issue here, a potential real danger here, something really unhealthy here that gets people's religion off track and their faith life off track. But at the same time, there could be valid points here.
Yeah.
You know, and we need to talk about the synodal process in the church that's going on right now, but I'm kind of wondering if one of the outcomes of that process will be a more traditionalist movement being expressed out of that. But let's go to this. So we agree that there's no problem having a liturgical preference, you know, having a certain liturgy that you like better. There is something wrong when you go to Mass and you become a liturgical critic.
Yeah.
It's like the difference between saying I like action movies and I'm actually writing the criticism of the movie that I'm watching.
No, I mean, you can't, right. You're not actually enjoying the movie, right? If you're the critic. Well, I don't know actually how critics watch movies, but anyway, and I think it's like, you know, every Mass, I love this about the Catholic Church. Like every Mass, no matter how uninspiring or dull or weird it, you know, there's just like a very small number of things needed for like, you know, a piece of bread to become Jesus Christ, right? And there's like graces at every Mass. And if you're distracted, you know, nitpicking, it's hard to open yourself, you know, to kind of fully accept, you know, I don't want to say you still can't get graces. I'm not saying that, but there's just like,
I think you're limiting graces. I mean, I would say that. I would say that like if you are critical of all the people you're going to Mass with, or if you're critical of the priest himself while he delivers Mass and you're like in that mindset, you have actually defeated liturgy.
Yeah.
Like the whole point of liturgy you have undermined in your own liturgical preferences. You've somehow defeated the whole process of liturgy.
Yeah. And I think people, I think there's like a tendency to, you know, sometimes like a priest does something really weird at Mass and it's like annoying, you know, and I wish they wouldn't. And I think it would be better if they didn't. But there's like a fundamental choice that is mine to just like accept that is what is happening. And I am at Mass and I'm gonna, you know, take the graces that are available. Yeah, I love there's this like Tolkien quote that's been floating around recently where he says like if your faith is sagging, like, you know, take communion frequently. And he says like you should go to communion in a place that affronts your tastes, you know, that the priest is either kind of I'm paraphrasing here, kind of dull or babbling, or there's like a lot of dirty school children or, you know, people that are not as, you know, reverent as you would like them to be. And he says that this could be, it will be the same or even better than a Mass said beautifully by a visibly holy man and shared by a few devout and decorous people. And so I think that's like the point. You kind of have to die to yourself to accept like the gift, right, that is being offered. And I think being the liturgical critic is kind of often not that, you know.
Well, I'll stick by what I said. When you're a liturgical critic, you undermine the liturgy you're in. You know? And I mean, just the whole point of liturgy is supposed to transport you or take you, or you're supposed to go along with it or consent to it. But when you criticize, you're kind of just blocking that, you know, which just, I mean, it's not that the Eucharist isn't the Eucharist and there aren't some graces, but you have limited it. Let's go to this other idea about like, there's more than a liturgical preference here. And that's part of what's troubling about it, you know? Years ago, my wife and I were going to social engagements and we were meeting a lot of traditionalist Catholics. And there was something about the conversation that her and I came away with like the same impression. There was something about the conversation that went to talking about how much you prefer a certain type of liturgy, how much you like guns, even if you're a woman, how much you smoke, or you used to smoke, or smoking was always brought up. And also burning gasoline was brought up. Like a 1970s car or some form of burning gasoline was brought up. And then you have to sit back and you have to be like, what was that? Like, why did we just go to the same conversation 4 times where these 4 like issues were brought up, right? And it's like, what's the connecting thread? What's the philosophical thread here? And the only thread that makes sense to me is it's just anti-liberalism. You know, it's not that burning gas has anything to do with the Latin Mass, but they're both like an objection to liberalism.
Yeah.
And there's this
it's kind of funny because I feel like conservatives get upset about liberals virtue signaling, you know,
right,
and
right,
this is like
yeah.
the opposite.
Well, this is
It's
where
like,
in the Old Testament, there's a scene where they're trying to figure out who's on whose team, and the Jews are fighting the Jews, and they're swimming over this river, escaping the battle. And when they get off the other side, they go, say the word shibboleth. And if you were of the enemy tribe, you always mispronounced it, like you were from Brooklyn or something, and compared to like from Queens or something. And so then like you were done if you mispronounced shibboleth. And so like I heard Pope Benedict use, he goes, this is the shibboleth of orthodoxy, like the word signal you use to show that you're a member of the club, you know. But really, I've seen this idea somewhere else too, because I'll talk to people who are kind of in the more radical traditionalist movement. And instead of actually defending their position, sometimes they claim that the reason why they need their position is because of the crazy liberal abuse, right? Which actually doesn't totally follow. But there's a certain amount of the two extremes need each other. And by the way, I want to say as an aside, if you're anti-liberal right now in American politics, you are right a weird amount of the time. And it's almost disturbing how much you're right merely by being anti-liberal, because of just where we are, I believe, right now in our politics. But when you look at these extreme groups, even in our American political situation, like if on one side is Antifa and if on the other side is like a neo-Nazi, they need each other. Like there's even cases where they've kind of collaborated with each other. Antifa justifies its existence by the existence of the other extreme. And so much so that if they can't find any neo-Nazis, they have to make them up. Yeah. You know, to justify their existence. Yeah. And I think the same's true here with like rad trads, is they need people who are hyper progressive and want to change all the teachings in order to justify their existence of not wanting to change even small t traditions. Yeah. You know?
Yeah. And I think this is, it's like if you can't find the Nazis, you find new Nazis, you know, and the newer and newer Nazis are kind of doing less and less egregious things, you know. Right. I don't know. Yeah.
And there's actually just a logical fallacy
I see
there.
That. Right.
You know, like you don't need to have another, just because you have an error on one side, you don't need an opposite error.
Yeah, and I think this also goes back to a point we made in the last podcast about like liturgical abuse. You know, it's like people are fighting liturgical abuse, but the liturgical abuse is getting less and less common, and you're still like worked up about liturgical abuse. Like, is there ever a time when you like are victorious, you know, or do you just always want to stay in the fight?
Right. Exactly. I've got a point about that I was going to think about making later, that when I was like, you know, starting Simple House and in my early 20s, I had like a sense of like, I am Orthodox and that means I'm against this. And I need to show people that I really believe in all the teachings of the church and everything like that. And then I just had this like sense of like, this is just like not real religion. You know, like if I'm trying to constantly prove how Orthodox I am, that's not real religion. And if I'm trying to like kind of like just kind of be at war with these other people who don't believe the way I believe, that's not real religion. I, in a sense, am Orthodox and I need to get over it. Yeah. You know, I need to be comfortable with my orthodoxy that I don't have this need to like signal and this need to like engage like that, you know, and that only through that do I get to like real religion, which would be love and hope and faith and, you know, like actually serving these people and probably actually doing a much better job of evangelizing them.
Yeah, I know, like, I've had a struggle with, like, you know, I would want to say, like, make sure I didn't say the wrong thing or I didn't mislead somebody by kind of talking about the wrong ideas or something. And there's, like, just some kind of, like, lack of freedom there. And I've always admired people who seem like they can engage, like, not Catholic ideas seriously without worrying about, you know, are they gonna make somebody else think the wrong thing because they are so thoroughly Catholic that they're not like afraid of kind of experimenting with those ideas or something. And there's just something like about that. I think the way God intended his children to be free, you know, and not afraid in that.
That reminds me that like, Pope Benedict sat down. He did three or four really long form interviews that became books. And then one of them that came out, I think when he was Pope, he said, the interviewer asked, if you were a gay prostitute in Africa and you have HIV, what if you used a contraceptive device?
Okay, wait. I think you're sort of exaggerating the question, but
I don't think so. Okay. All right. You tell me your do you want me to say? Let me say my whole question, and then you summarize it the way you remember it.
Okay.
All right, because I am working from memory. And then Pope Benedict's like, that could be a move towards charity in his heart if he tried to protect people from the HIV while being a prostitute.
Yeah, I thought that the question was just about like a married couple using condoms when the husband had HIV, and I think, right. So,
all right.
But anyway,
I know I read the book, but I don't remember. All right. Let's just throw it out there.
Like
Either way,
it gave people like brain damage, and all he wasn't saying it's licit to use condoms. Like that's not what he was saying. But he was just recognizing that there could be an act of love there, Well, it could be moving someone in the right direction. Yeah,
I think you're trying to make his point, and that's not what's important. I think the point to be made here is that he was comfortable enough in his orthodoxy that he waded into this stupid thought experiment that was like I thought the thought experiment, like the way I expressed it, it was really stupid. It was like, given you're already doing something immoral, and you're going to keep doing something immoral. What if you do this? And he's like, well, okay, well then maybe, like, I don't know. But like he wasn't afraid to even try to answer that. Whereas if you're only trying to say something totally correct all the time, you don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, I think this has happened to me more than one time where I've been like in a sort of like Catholic group study thing where I've been trying to say the right thing and people haven't come back. And it's like, I didn't engage really the idea, and someone needed the idea to be engaged. Like you didn't really answer their question because you were too worried about saying the right thing. Right. Especially like, with tricky issues like contraception. Right. Right.
Well, let's and both Laura and I are against contraception, just to be clear.
Yeah. Right.
Got confused in that. Right.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting about this kind of like political idea of like two extreme airs needing each other is there's also this irony there. Like if you look at Antifa and the neo-Nazis, they're actually way more similar than they appear. Like they have a lot of the same principles at work, meaning like Antifa believes that what has defined history is racial struggle, so do the neo-Nazis. They both believe this far more than anyone else in the middle does, you know? And there's something weird also about like the radical traditionalist critiques of Vatican II are exactly the same position of the radical progressives.
Vatican II was all about changing doctrine, and
it's supposed to be a great updating of tradition and changing of doctrine. None of which was the intent of Vatican II. Anyone in the middle would not share those views, but the two extremes who kind of may or less hate each other actually agree with each other. Ironically. So let's talk about what is the Vatican's. So part of what I see in these conversations is there's a lot of playing politics within the church. There's like trying to guess how JP2 felt and how Benedict felt and what was their secret agenda versus what they actually did and et cetera, right? So let's just throw all that out the window because I hate that playing politics. Mm-hmm. Let's just say, what is the agenda of the Vatican on this issue? I think we can express it fairly straightforward.
This issue being, you're saying this issue being like liturgical reform, right? So I think, I don't know. I mean, I think they like a united worship, right? Right.
They want. I think they more or less want a united worship, and they have repeatedly left the door open for some ethnic and cultural variety within that worship.
Yeah.
But more or less within your community and your nation or whatever, that you guys would be worshiping the same way and it wouldn't be radically different from place to place.
Yeah, it's like that. It would make sense to the people that were engaged in the worship. Yeah.
Now how much tradition you use within that, like exactly what your vestments look like, exactly how many candles you're lighting or how much incense you're burning and all these things. I think there's a lot of room there where the Vatican would be okay with this all shaking out in a lot of different places. I just don't think they believe it's going to shake out into a Latin Mass.
Yeah.
I think there's a sense in which we're still always going to be like, in a sense, modifying the Mass slightly over time. Because our cultures and change over time and things like this. But I just don't think they think it's going to end up in the Latin Mass, and they don't want it to end up in the Latin Mass for the same reasons why they started Vatican II in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty simple vision. And with that vision, you both are, alienating both the rad trads and the radical progressives, With all this, though, you have to ask, I went to lunch 2 days ago with a guy, and I didn't know this about him. I knew he was pretty successful in the church and had done a lot of jobs within the church as a layman. But I didn't know, he told me he's about 50, and he said he was raised in a traditionalist household, only going to the Latin Mass. And then without me saying anything, without me saying, hey, I'm working on a podcast right now about this, he goes, my problem with it is I don't see any positive vision for the movement. Right. Yeah. And there's kind of an old Catholic idea that the church is not against anything, meaning that it's a truism because God created all things. Therefore, all things are from God. And if you're against a thing, you're against God. I think it's an Augustinian idea. Like evil is not a thing. Evil is like a corruption of a good thing. So you have to be very careful when you're against things. And so if we go on like a Catholic crusade, we need to go on a Catholic crusade that's building something, not just merely tearing down.
Yeah.
But it's way easier to whip people up against something. You see this at like Republican National Convention or whatever. It's way easier to build a base against something than to build a base to build something. And part of that's just the ease of it. It's just so much easier to destroy a building than to build a building. So I was sitting at a classical school conference and a talk, and it was a beautiful talk. And I was trying to like figure out what is the goal here? Like, is the goal that all our kids become super smart and become the new intelligentsia of society? Is the goal to restore some society? And I kind of I tried to come up with like a positive goal for the traditionalist movement. And I'm lumping classical education is not the traditionalist movement, but there's a sense in which they run together sometimes.
Yeah, there's a big overlap there.
There's a big overlap, yeah.
Yeah. And my kids are getting a classical education right now,
right.
which we're like very happy about. Like I wouldn't want to send them anywhere else.
My kids are getting a Montessori education, to be different. But I came up with this thought experiment there, like for a positive vision. So let me read this out, and everyone think about whether or not you want the world I'm describing. Because I think this world is, in a sense, a hope of some of the people in this movement. It's a place where people show great reverence when praying and celebrate every sacrament with the utmost reverence. In this place, 99% of the population is a believing Catholic. You got 1% non-believer, just to show you got some freedom in there. A place where people show propriety and decorum. People carry themselves like they understand their own dignity. A place where morality is publicly accepted. When people sin, they know it's wrong, and it's clear to everyone that they're a sinner. A place where artists and creators strive for beauty. There wouldn't be any kind of nonsense art with people trying to do something ugly or just something interesting. They'd always be like, these artists and creators would try to do something great and beautiful. All the teachers would strive towards truth. There'd be some mild disagreements, but it'd all be safely within the Western classical tradition. And in general, all the genius is applied to this tradition. A place where everyone is kind of wealthy. We have as much luxury as the kings of old. You couldn't be a glutton, but everyone could have cookies from France, silk from China, coffee from Ethiopia, and a car from Japan. And a place that has a sense of honor. And to the extent there's any violence, it's a gentleman teaching a rogue a lesson, slapping him around a bit, so even the rogue could become a gentleman. This is strange because every point I gave is hard to disagree with. But the question is, would you buy into that all as the society that you're trying to build?
Well, and right, there's like attractive things in everything that you're saying there, right? But it is kind of like a strange idea. It made me think of like two things. One is I haven't read this book, but like the Benedict option. right?
Creating that in a micro. Yeah.
Yeah. And also like The Awakening of Miss Prim. Has that been in your circles? Has Audrey read it? No. Okay. I don't know. I think there's like kind of it's a limited vision. The thing that, but I find it attractive. And there's just like the one problem, like, what do you do with all the other people?
Well, I don't know. I think the idea is that you've already converted all the other people. Yeah, I think, like the Benedict option is a way to take the thought experiment I said. And the other way is you think that we just rebuilt medieval France, Yeah. Or I really think the right idea, I think there's a whimsical look back on like Victorian England. They just wish Victorian England was Catholic and not Protestant. It's like everyone knew the right and wrong. There was strong decorum. There was this orderly society. And it seems to produce Oscar Wildes. Yeah. It seems to produce like rogues at the end of the day, Yeah. But I don't think there's anything wrong with Victorian England and even appreciating it as maybe a high watermark in some ways, I just have a problem thinking that Christ came to bring us Victorian England. I don't think that's the Christian society that he was pointing us towards.
Yeah, I also think that you're missing, when we think of Victorian England, we're not thinking of most of the people in Victorian England.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I wonder. To me, like the historical question is open to me. I know there would have been suffering in Victorian England in a lot of ways, but I don't know that even the poor weren't maybe more gentlemanly than we thought. Maybe they were rogues. Yeah, that could be. Maybe they were having bar fights and getting drunk all the time, but maybe not. That's open to me. But there is this desire for this. And like we saw this 20 years ago that at Catholic University and even at your brother's university, there was starting of the Estovere Men's Club. It was like, we are missing something. We want to bring it back. When you look for something to bring back, I think chivalry is what they're pointing at, Yeah. And chivalry is interesting because it's a very kind of an idealized thing right now. Like it has been for a long time an idealized thing. Like it's not a natural thing. It's more like a LARPing thing that we do. Live action role playing is what LARPing means. But maybe LARPing isn't wrong. Like they fake it till you make it type thing. But
I thought, and I want to say I think Estovere was a really good thing.
Yeah.
The guys, yeah.
But the dangerous part of it that I see is I think chivalry is an enemy of Catholicism. And that bothers people when I say that. But in a sense, Ignatius Loyola converted from chivalry to Catholicism. Chivalry is based on this like exaggerated romantic love. It's this like exaggerated sense of honor. You have people fighting to the death the next day over an insult. And this is just not Christian. You have the love triangle of King Arthur where the Lancelot's in love with King Arthur's wife, but they're keeping it chaste by some miracle. This is just not Christian at the end of the day. This is not like it's idyllic in this. It's something that people really get into. But I actually think the church was fighting chivalry back when chivalry was the norm. And now I think
something that maybe chivalry captures that we're missing is something that the early Christians had. And that's like you're like willing to die for something you believe in,
Right.
Yeah.
It gives a lot of dignity to the individual.
And I also think that chivalry has something that could also be missing in a lot of like, especially like 80s and 90s Christianity is like a role for masculinity, or an outlet for masculinity that is needed, So
I would argue that,
those are my two defenses.
Masculinity today is broken. Chivalry is not going to be the answer, bringing that back, but it is maybe a more healthy form, or I don't know. I don't even want to try
I guess it points to that we're missing something. We're searching for something. We want something that we are not finding. Yeah.
I actually think that's where a lot of this came from, is that they realize the need that we're missing, but they're lacking exactly what to work for. And I think that's partly the whole problem of this movement that's anti-liberal is that it's lacking that a good positive vision. And then the positive vision I just posited, this like new Victorian England Catholicism, a Catholic Victorian period, is just not it either, Yeah. And I think that Flannery O'Connor and Dostoevsky are the insightful people who are trying to get you to realize this.
Right. Yeah. And it's fun. Yeah. It's funny because the traditional movement loves those two.
I know. And it's kind of funny.
And they
it's
don't
like,
fit. They don't fit in that.
Right. And I don't think it's just the traditionalist movement. Any respectable Catholic, any person in polite society who says they love Flannery O'Connor, I want to hear an explanation of that, because it's not polite at all.
Right.
It makes, I mean, it's basically saying that real religion and real virtue is happening in very kind of, in a sense, horrible people with very grave problems.
Yeah.
Grave sin, grave problems, whatever you want to call it. But but the
and
heroes,
like that Christ is like incarnate somehow in a guy that is like drowning.
Dostoevsky is basically saying there could be a prostitute in this city praying better than every other Christian in the city, and then she's still a prostitute the next day. And that type of realization, I think Dostoevsky is true when he's making it, and it's so scandalous. And it's so scandalous as to what you're doing with your Knights of Columbus Club and what you're doing with your prayer group and what you're doing at Simple House. It's like, what does that mean? Yeah. But I think that it also is saying that the Victorian ideas, or this, like, it's kind of critiquing a goody two shoes goal, Yeah. I think also Brideshead Revisited, there's the very end of it. I don't want to give, I'm giving away the ending. Tune out.
No, don't give it.
There's one of the main characters who's got serious problems, but is Catholic, ends up as a humble gardener in a monastery, and then he gets drunk every month. It's been a while since I read it.
He's like lowlier than the monk. Yeah.
Right. He might be the best monk there, but he's getting drunk every month. So he's kind of got this grave sin he hasn't kicked.
Yeah.
But it's very beautiful somehow what's happening there.
Yeah.
And the author of that, Evelyn Waugh, was a huge proponent of the Latin Mass, by the way. Okay, back to the topic.
So I have a did you want to say more about your vision? I guess my question is, do you think there could be like a positive vision?
I think there always has to be a positive vision for Christianity. But I think I'm agreeing with, I am becoming extremely anti-utopian. And what I mean by that is we love building ideal societies and utopias as like an argument, as a conversation piece or whatever. And then we kind of ask, okay, now that I know what the ideal society is, how do I get from here to there? What's my next step here to build it? Right. That to me is a utopian way of approaching the problem. Because in reality, you don't even know what the US is going to look like if the interest rate goes to 10%.
Yeah.
You don't even know, like, minor changes in our reality completely take us by surprise. Like, no one could have predicted the internet.
Why do you think people, so I think like the utopian thought experiment is interesting, but why do you think people want that?
Well, I saw a great comic. I'll summarize it. There's two like kind of philosophers sitting next together, and one said, equality is the highest virtue. And then they kind of talk about equality, and it gets to a dystopia, that if you found society all in equality, it becomes a dystopia. Then the next guy goes, well, it's not equality, it's property rights. Then they talk about that long enough, it becomes a dystopia. And they go, it's not property rights, it's justice. And then they talk about that until it becomes dystopia. And they do this like for 3 or 4 concepts of like, if that was the main concept, how could that go wrong, right? And then at the end they go, well, maybe the lesson here is that there is no thought experiment or thing that you can hold in isolation that will create the ideal society, and that thought experiments aren't worth having. And then then they get really upset because they're like, it would be a dystopia if we were not having thought experiments. Like, we love thought experiments. But I really think, I have a friend who expressed this view. It's like Jesus Christ is the way. And the way is given so much more time in Scripture than the destination. Yeah. And if you're worried about the way, and you're worried about putting one foot in front of the other, following Christ, being more kind, being more loving, just ordering society, all these different things, just one step at a time is what's your problem, and not spending your time worried about multilateral nuclear disarmament, which is just frankly not your job and is utopian, and you have almost no influence over,
most of us.
Most of it, probably even the people in charge don't. But you actually then are really doing Christian progress. And somehow the utopian thing is a distraction, and it kind of gets you off track. And I need to for book club, we need to get into St. Thomas More's Utopia, because I'm starting to wonder if this is part of the point he's making, but I don't remember that work well enough to comment on it. But
yeah. I don't remember it well enough either. I will just say I was like disappointed because I was like hoping to read it and have the handbook.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a way, there needs to be something that we're building towards, but I think what we're building towards is going to be extremely simple. It's going to be like, how does my parish become more loving? How does my parish become less sinful? How do I personally do that? Right.
Yeah. And how do I, make it easier for myself, for my friends, for my neighbors, for my kids to stay on the way? Right.
And I'm almost certain that whatever we build will not look like something in the past.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think we're going to be able to take a moment in history and recreate that moment.
Yeah.
It's going to be a new Christianity perfection of our own day, which is not very satisfying to people, because I'm not giving a hugely, defined positive vision with that. But let's go back to our main topic. So what is the social and psychological appeal of this? We already talked about being against something and all of that. But I think we're seeing at Simple House, we've been basically working with a fresh crop of 21, 22-year-olds for the last 20 years. Every year we get a new crop of 21, 22-year-olds. And the current crop is more conservative, more anxious. I think anxiety is something that is a way bigger deal in our culture than it used to be.
Yep.
I think I kind of grew up in the 80s, and I think if someone said there was something wrong with me, my mom's first reaction would be, there's nothing wrong with him. He just needs to try harder or do better or fix himself. Right. And I think now when I meet a young person, they are excited to list all of their limitations, their psychological problems, their dietary restrictions, like they want to advertise that list in a sense, as opposed to hide it, as opposed to try to fix it. It's almost like a badge of honor the more problems you come into.
Yeah, I mean, with. I think there was maybe a misplaced shame before, and I think there's been an overcorrection where it's like an identity, like, your mental illnesses or issues are your identity, right? And you wear them as a badge of honor, like you're saying. And
worrying about those problems, as opposed to like a more future looking worry, like instead of being concerned about how to make progress, you're almost concerned about managing problems that you have, and I see that a lot. And there's something that people want stricture, and people want to be told how to do it, and people want everything figured out on the plate, and they're not wanting the mystery of Christ, the relationship, the much more difficult part. Not difficult. What do you call that? It is difficult if you're anxious. If you're afraid of the freedom. It's
ambiguous, right? I think I think this thing, about like, I wanted St. Thomas More to give me the handbook, it's like, I feel overwhelmed with engaging with real life, and I just want someone to tell me how to do it, and then I can feel like I'm safely on the way. And,
So, yes, exactly. So if you find a Catholic religious leader who's willing to oversimplify life, oversimplify Catholic doctrine, and hand someone a to-do list, they like that, and they will shy away from someone who's trying to lead them into a stranger, scarier, less defined place that's actually probably more Jesus there.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I think the to-do list and the anxiety is like society wide, right?
Right.
But,
yeah.
I'm
This is just an expression of it within the church. I agree.
Yeah.
And there's also this desire that's a twin to this, that's like a desire for purity. And I grew up seeing this in the Protestant church that I went to, the Church of Christ. Yeah. And I remember two schisms. And one schism was the Church of Christ is just a more or less evangelical / fundamentalist Protestant church. And the main thing that differentiates them from everybody else is they do not believe in using musical instruments. They have some verse in the Bible that they fundamentally interpreted as never using musical instrument in church. So it's actually cool. Like I will literally now go on YouTube and listen to Church of Christ singing, you know, because it's actually amazing what they achieve just getting the congregation to sing. So much better than anything I've ever seen in the Catholic Church. I hate to say that, but it is, you know. So one time the music director got in 4 men, a quartet, and they sang one of the songs at church, right? And we still did all the regular congregational singing also, but we had these 4 men sing for part of it. And then at the end, then the next week, an elder of the church stood up and was allowed to, for 15 minutes, explain why he was resigning and leaving the church because these 4 men had come in and sung, and how that was just not what this was about. And I remember there's a couple of strange things about this. One, it's strange that you're letting him talk to your whole congregation about why he's leaving and talk for 15 minutes uninterrupted about what he thinks is all wrong with the congregation, why he's leaving. That's a little bit strange. And the other thing is, as like a young dude, I was like, I've got mad respect for this elder. This is the most morally pure person I have ever seen, that he is resigning over these 4 guys who sung, right?
Yeah.
And that's just insane. That you would have a schism over 4 people singing, you know, that you wouldn't work together to figure that out, you know?
Yeah.
And another example of it was.
But was he like kind of being a jerk, but you were like, he is being a jerk for justice?
He was wearing,
something?
I am very humble, I can't handle this.
Okay.
He wasn't like being a televangelist. It's something that you don't see on TV, you know, it's something that happens in a Protestant church. It was I was probably 13 or 14 and I was 1. I thought it was the best. I thought this guy is so pure. And then the other thing that happened was the pastor, who was well-liked, had female ushers one time. And he got fired over having female ushers. And Dead Poets Society had just come out, right? Or had been out for a year or something. And, you know, their teacher gets fired, who they love, right? And so the Dead Poets Society scene. So they let this guy talk too, that he was leaving the church, and they let him have his 15 minutes of, which is for Catholics, that's an enormously long time to talk, 15 minutes, 15-minute explanation that he's leaving the church and blah, blah, blah. And he still loves us, whatever. And then like at the end, people are all standing and clapping for him. And then his real supporters start standing on the pews. And there's this really awkward moment of like, and I'm like, we fired this guy.
Yeah.
Like, we're not supposed to be happy. I mean, like, don't support him. We fired, you know. But I also was just like blown away about how willing they were to schism, you know. And I see that here. It's like they feel like that by separating into this contingent, and I'm calling it schism light. And I think that's the thing when you talk about next podcast about whether or not this actually is dangerous as a heresy or a schism. But it's like we're kind of separated ourselves. We only go to these religious orders. We only do this type of stuff. And that's the deal, you know? What's your thoughts?
Well, I don't know. I just obviously see like a lot of dangers in that because it becomes like, you know, I agree with what you're saying, but also then like this religious order is approved and this one is not. And, you know, the religious order that's approved could be doing weird things.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me throw out, like, I've always thought the calendar schism in the Orthodox Church is always funny, but their position was you changed the date of the celebration. We are schisming. And they thought of themselves as like, we're the true protectors of tradition. Like we've purely protected it by doing this, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's this confusion between holiness. There's confusion between like purity and exclusivity is getting mixed up with holiness and integrity, you know? And it's not integrity to schism like that or to not work with your fellow Christians, you know?
Yeah. I think the other thing that's weird about the purity in that sense is like you're protecting the true church, and is like, what is the true church, you know?
Right.
And is the true church not man, you know, like there's like, just there are men and women in it.
This happened to me is I live in this like transitional neighborhood. And the Republicans in my neighborhood are funny because it's like we live in the most diverse neighborhood, it's a liberal, idyllic neighborhood in so many ways. And the Republicans who have agreed to live here are very interesting people, like they're very interesting personalities, we'll say the least. So we had an election night watch party at one of my conservative friends in the neighborhood. And he basically had all the most crazy Republican guys over. And it was great. I mean, like I had never met these guys before. I just knew my neighbor. And I went, and they're all kind of have all these crazy stories about running people off their property with a shotgun and different things,
Oh my gosh.
And one of them then says, out of the blue, he starts talking about my friend Jordan. And my friend Jordan is very liberal, probably a pacifist, might be a socialist. I don't even know. But he's very, very liberal, right? Very much not for Trump, right? And these guys are kind of Trump guys, right?
He has dreadlocks.
He has dreadlocks, right?
Yeah.
He's a founder of another Catholic nonprofit called Jerusalem Farms. And this guy says, Jordan is the most Christ-like man I have ever met. And every few months, I go to just be near him to just see that. And I'm just like blown away that this guy who's like totally on the other end of the extreme has such mad respect. And the guy was Protestant too, has this mad respect for this Catholic progressive dude, right? And I'm also offended because I'm like, don't you know I run a ministry and I'm even closer to you? And can't I be the most Christ-like man you've ever seen? But I had this sense that at that moment that like I had to go through my head because it like in a funny way, it offended my pride. I was like, I had to go through my head though. What would it take for me to be more Christ-like than Jordan? And I thought I would have to be of more service than Jordan, more humble than Jordan, more loving than Jordan. And I was like, that's a tall order because Jordan is a great guy,
Yeah.
And
he's godfather of one of your children, right?
Right. We're friends. Yeah.
Just but he's a wonderful person. Yeah.
And that is a very that's a big glass of water or whatever. I mean, that's a hard pill to swallow. That's a tall order, Yeah. But if the way you get holiness is by excluding other people, by criticizing them, by being exclusive essentially, and just focusing on purity, no problem. You know what I mean? It's just it's a cheat code for religion. And it's not really growing closer to Christ. Yeah. I want to do something on King David about how impure he was, but actually is like the most Christ-like man, perhaps. I think we should go on to maybe the last major thing, which is there appears to be some psychological issues within the radical traditionalist movement, and they're usually called rigidity or just mental illness in general. And I would like to preface this by saying a book came out I read a while back that was kind of about the church in the 80s and the 90s and about how the word rigidity was used to persecute Orthodox seminarians and things. They would just label them as rigid because they won't want to change any of the teachings. They'd be kind of run out of the church. That book. I think that book was probably correct. And I think that that's horrible. But it also doesn't mean that rigidity is actually not something that does affect some people, even though it was overly abused and overprescribed as a way to persecute some Orthodox believers, it doesn't mean that it's also not a real issue.
Yeah. And I think you and I have both, spent a lot of time talking with both people who are kind of part of the more traditionalist movement and both people who have been put off by it. And it's like you don't want to pick on one quality of one person that you saw one time who happens to be more traditionalist, but it's like the rigidity is just like a thing that comes up over and over and over again, and a sort of like angriness about it too. And
I think we even know multiple priests who were kind of part of this movement who ended up hospitalized for their mental health.
Yeah.
And I also know people who just you just met them and you're just like, obviously there's a mental health issue here, even though the guy's more or less going to operate fine, but I'm not going to trust him with my kids, or I'm not going to trust him too much,
right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's So this book that you're saying, I don't know what book that is. I haven't read it, but like, I believe that I do not find it hard to believe that happened, right? That it was kind of abused that way. But if I know, like, the examples I can think of like, I've had, this kind of, story told to me multiple times of the seminarian that was kicked out of the seminary because he was too conservative, because he was trying to stick to the true teachings of the church, et cetera, et cetera. Like, just the people that I've come across. And like, one of those people started a religious order, and he was sexually abusing the seminarians in it,
right.
Another one was like a seminarian that was coming to help at a Simple House, and we had to ask him to leave, before, because it was like we could not let him be around. It was not okay to let him be around the people we serve,
So there's kind of like, I talk to a lot of seminarians. I also talk to a lot of seminary formators. And so none of this stuff is going to appear in your local Catholic newspaper. But there's kind of like stuff where they'll be like, I talk to a lot of seminarians from a very Orthodox diocese, Wichita, Kansas, right? Yeah. They're very comfortably Orthodox. They're kind of like my slogan of like, you're Orthodox, now get over it. They're kind of already got over it,
Yeah.
And they'll kind of talk about seminaries from other dioceses that are actually known as liberal dioceses, and that the seminarians are weird, and that they have a reputation, and that almost to the man they're weird, and they don't know what to do about it, Yeah. And it has something to do with like this like exaggerated reactionary anti-liberalism, essentially, right? Like that instead of like kind of coming necessarily to the seminary for the right reasons, they're just so anti-liberal, and that's why they came to make their mark this way, And it's just not mentally healthy, particularly, to do that. I also have heard that, some nuns who prefer the Latin Mass used to almost exclusively find people to celebrate the Latin Mass who were pre-Vatican II priests who had celebrated it back in their youth, as opposed to the younger priests who were so set on wanting to celebrate the Tridentine Mass because they just felt like the younger priests were off somehow,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like, we don't want to say that every young priest that celebrates Latin Mass is off, because I'm sure there's some lovely people out there. But I do think I see this like in conservative circles more, not just Latin Mass, but also there, that people, there's a priest that's like a little bit off, and it's like, oh, he's just so holy. Right. He's set apart. That's
a very dangerous attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't, like a holy person isn't going to make you feel like, huh.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Real holiness makes you more human, more approachable, more real, more relatable. That's what real holiness is. So when you find someone who's constructed a holiness reputation out of being odd, you should more think they're odd than holy.
I mean, and not plenty of saints were odd, right? But
well, everyone has their own idiosyncrasies, you know what I mean? But like,
that's not what we're, Yeah.
It's kind of like the kid I remember in high school who'd be like, I just do this because I'm weird. Right. Yeah. I'm holy like this because I'm weird,
Yeah. Or the kid that's always like telling you how smart he is,
right.
Right.
And what's interesting about this to me is like, we're talking about this, and I'm glad that we're talking about this publicly, but the church has no reason to ever want to talk about this publicly. Like, there's not going to be any statistics that come out on this.
Yeah.
The Latin Mass guys don't want to do that. The church doesn't want to do that. The seminaries don't want to do that. There's no motivation to do that. The secular world's not even interested enough to talk about it,
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they're not talking about it behind closed doors and they're like, hey, this is an issue, And as lay people, I think we need to be somewhat aware it's an issue so that we kind of don't fall into kind of little subcults, you know?
Yeah.
Another thing related to this was there was this great idea. I liked the idea more than I liked the execution. I haven't been around it for a long time, but it used to be called the Institute for Psychological Studies. And it changed its name to Divine Mercy U or something like that. But I love the idea. We need a truly supernatural psychological study. that is a very worthwhile idea, you know? But it was founded by the Legionnaires of Christ, directly or indirectly, I'm not sure. Regnum Christi and the Legionnaires are related institutions. And the kind of scuttlebutt was they founded it because they were having so many psychological problems in their very traditionalist order, you know?
Yeah.
But once again, like, I say that, and I don't want to be just a gossip, but like, that will never be in a Catholic newspaper. That will never be, you know, there's just no one has the interest of putting that out there, you know?
Yeah. I think you told me that and I tried to find it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I suspect that's true though. Just because it felt true when you looked at the organization and like heard about it and things like that. I was like, yeah, that's probably why that was founded, you know?
What do you say? You know, what would you say? Like I hear, people kind of defend some of the maybe anger or, kind of feelings like they have to be so defensive on saying that they've been sort of like persecuted or oppressed or, put down or abused by the church, you know?
Right.
How would you answer that?
I think overreacting is never right. You know, like you have to go for truth. You can't go for righting a wrong with another wrong. You know what I mean? And you can't even excuse it that way. Like if you're saying that, hey, the reason why I'm so anti this is because they were anti me for so long. And now that's the same thing as saying I need therapy. Not that you should be a spiritual leader.
Yeah.
You know, it's not that you should be spreading your spiritual beliefs. It's more like I need to heal from what happened to me. And then hopefully I can get to a more healthy religious place where I'm not a reactionary, you know?
Yeah.
So I have heard that argument. And I think that it's problematic. Right. So.
Yeah.
Well, how about we wrap this up and we'll come back and we'll talk about whether or not there's a real danger here that this could become a schism or that there's a heresy that crept in the church through this. Once again, I think liturgical preferences are fine and the church may even be on its way to becoming more traditional, and we're not against that.
I think if there's a more traditional, you know, like a healthy traditional movement will include people that are like psychologically well, you know, and healed or healing, you know, and it will be inviting. And it will be positive. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think that's right. And good to see you, Laura. Good to see you, Clark. All right. See you next week. All right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.